Soul Farm. Excellent. That song is called Rachaman, the merciful one. If you like beautiful, holy Jewish nigunim, melodies, wordless melodies, and you like rock and roll, you like Soul Farm. How are you? It's great to be with you, my holy sisters and brothers. Let's light up the darkness. Very excited about tonight's DAF. This is going to be a terrific page. The 7 prophetesses of Israel. Need I say more? Who is with us as we gather for a key DAF on a Sunday night? Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Yehuda in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Paul in Chicago, Sharon in Lebanon, John in Sedona, Brandon in Knoxville, Heather says Shalom, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Christo in Lubbock, Renee in Indiana, Guy in Ohio, Gwen in Michigan, Eliseo from Rosemead, Lucy in Minnesota, Christo in Lubbock, Stu Rigar, that's a new name, in Cleveland, Patrice in Utah, Leah in LA, James in Annapolis, Lindsay in Cincinnati, Jeannie in Monticello, Indiana, a new one. Welcome, Jeannie, welcome everybody who maybe you're here all the time and you just gonna, unlurk and say hello and put your name in. Beautiful, welcome. Paul likes that I'm dancing. Listen, dancing before the Lord, that's what David did. And that was a good moment in Footloose when Kevin Bacon talked about that. You guys remember that movie? Hannah in New York, Charles in Omaha, Bill in Mid-Missouri, David in Indiana, Shandor in the Bronx, Leah. Can you send your soundtrack in an email? Yeah, absolutely. It's just a digital download and you can buy it on our site at picturesfromthefringe.com. That's our production company. We made Saving Lincoln. And when do we eat? And we're making Guns and Moses. That's between us, just right in here, in our little cells in the class. Our next movie, we are really pumped about it. I'm not going to say anything more about it right now. Austin in Houston, Sam in Virginia, Cole. Pattern recognition is not a crime. I'm not sure what that means. And Bill, my Nana, love Footloose. And Sharon, I did a Sukkot teaching on the 7 prophetesses. This is going to be a great night. Over there on the YouTube side, Ifa. Tonight, welcome Ifa. Tonight in Florida, right? Ocala. All right, tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Cass Waters. Beautiful dedication in Thanksgiving for another healthy year. Amen. May you keep having healthy years to 120, and so may we all. Thank you for sponsoring tonight's episode and enabling us to share more Torah with more people. Cass, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say Amen. Have I mentioned our annual campaign? It's running out. We're in the last week. The donations are double till the end of the year. If you've donated already, thank you, and consider donating again. If you haven't donated, you got to help us make our goal. We got a long way to go. It's 1 week to go. We're like a 63%. We need your help. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All right. Where are we holding? We have been doing for 4 pages. On page 9, DAF test, right? We had our most recent Mishna number 13 here in chapter 1. And it was a string of Mishnas that were a digression from the subject of the Megillah, the book of Esther, the laws of Purim. It was a digression to talk at the Mishnaic level of the only difference between this thing and another thing is a few nuances or differences in the laws. And the last one we did was the only difference between the Mishkan in Shiloh, right, when the tabernacle was still standing in Shiloh, and the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. They were both the place that had the Mizbeach, that had the holy altar where we could bring the sacrifices. But because of the nature of one being a tent in a temporary temporary place, and the other being the holy temple in Jerusalem consecrated for all time, there were some differences in the halachas and in the laws. And we discussed that for a little while. And then we made our way back, really without, saying anything about the Mishna, but the flow of the Gemara has found its way back to interpreting the verses of the book of Esther. So we're on page 14 today, right? So it's 5 pages that we've been doing that off of Mishnah 13, but now what we're doing is in a real kind of midrash style, the rabbis interpreting and suggesting meanings and possibilities and even stories and traditions that they've heard. What really was going on in the story of Esther, and we're going verse by verse on the verses they choose to interpret. So we finished yesterday by saying that Achashverosh, King Achashverosh, who the sages have been, pretty clear, was not an innocent sort of side character in the story who, grants power first to Haman and then to Esther and Mordecai, but rather a wicked man in his own right. And we finished by saying that Achashverosh said yes when Haman said, let's kill all the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Yes, you can carry out your genocidal plan to wipe out all the Jews in one day. That was Esther 3:11. Now we go to our page 14. Rabbi Abba said, the actions of Ahasuerus and Haman can be understood with a parable. To what may they be compared? To 2 individuals, one of whom had a mound in the middle of his field, and the other had a ditch in the middle of his field, each one suffering from his own predicament. And the owner of the ditch, right, he has a hole in his land and he needs it to be filled. The owner of the ditch, noticing that the other one has a mound of dirt, says to himself, who will give me this mound of dirt that is suitable for filling my ditch? I would even be willing to pay for it. I would give money for that dirt, the owner of that mound, to fill in my ditch. Now, the owner of the mound, noticing the ditch on the other guy's land, says to himself, wow, who would give me this ditch so that for money I would pay for it to get all the excess dirt in my mound and drop it off in that ditch. I would even pay for it. And at a later point, one day, they happen to meet one another. And the owner of the ditch said to the owner of the mound, sell me your mound so I can fill my ditch. And the mound's owner, anxious to rid himself of that mound, finally has a chance to get rid of that mound, says to the owner of the ditch, take it! Take my mound of dirt for free. If only you had done so sooner. Similarly, Achashverosh himself wanted to destroy the Jews, and he was delighted when Haman showed up with similar aspirations and was willing to do the job for him, and he demanded no money from him. Haman was willing to pay the king for the favor of allowing him to kill all the Jews in one day, and Achashverosh said, no, you don't have to pay me. Right? It's like these two guys, were waiting to meet each other so they could both enact this horrific deed. New subject. At this moment, when Achashverosh said yes to Haman, that we're going to talk about that moment, and visually, like if you're picturing this like a film director would picture it, what exactly is happening when Achashverosh says, yes, you can do it? He takes the ring off his hand and gives it to Haman, presumably the signet ring, the seal, so that he could seal the decree. And the verse states, and the king removed his ring from his hand. Esther 3:10. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said, the removal of Achashverosh's ring for the sealing of Haman's decree was more effective than the 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses of Israel. In what way? Then the 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses who prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people. How is the removal of the ring more effective than the 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses who prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people? As all these people, the 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses, were all unable to return the Jewish people to the right way, right? Living all of them a Torah life. But the removal of Achashverosh's ring returned them to the right way. since it brought them to repentance. And that right there, my friends, is the reason some would say that anti-Semitism, that Jew hatred, has always existed throughout time. Since there have been Jews, somehow if the Jews won't learn the lesson themselves, right, it's our enemies who make us pull together and pray to God and cry out to God. Would that we would unite and be kind and good to each other and fear God and love God and do what we are instructed to do in the Torah without wearing terror for our lives from these maniacs. And the sages taught in a Baraisa 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people. Now that we've brought up the 55 prophets of Israel, the 55 people who prophesied on behalf of Israel, let's learn more about them. So 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people, and they neither subtracted nor added onto what is written in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that God gave to Moses, that set the law for all time. And all these prophets who came and revealed God's word to the Jewish people did not add or subtract to the law, introducing no changes or additions to the mitzvahs, to the commandments, except for the reading of the Megillah. What a great transition right back to the subject of our tractate, Megillah. The only mitzvah added to the Torah by the whole contingent of 55 people who prophesied, all the prophets, the only commandment that was added as a commandment, Doraisa, a written commandment, was the reading of the Megillah, which they added as an obligation for all future generations. And the Gemara asks, what exposition, right? What understanding of the words of the Torah led them to determine that this was a proper mode of action? If in all those centuries and all those prophets and prophetesses, nobody added or subtracted to the law, why did the people who said, and you will read the Megillah, you will read the book of Esther out loud, and you are commanded to hear it out loud on Purim every year, what led them to think that they had permission to change the law when all those other people in all those other centuries had not? What exposition led them to determine that this was a proper mode of action? On what basis did they add to the mitzvah? On what basis did they add this mitzvah? And Rabbi Chia bar Avin said that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha said that they reasoned as follows. If, when recalling the Exodus from Egypt, in which the Jews were delivered from slavery to freedom, we recite songs of praise, the song of the sea, and the hymns of Hallel, well, then in order to properly recall the miracle of Purim and commemorate God's delivering us from death to life, right? From Egypt, we were rescued from slavery. In Purim, we were rescued from death. Right, so that's a good kal v'chomer. If we're going to recite all these songs and make it a mitzvah, a commandment to recite those songs when we were rescued from slavery, all the more so we should be singing songs and have a commandment to do it when we're rescued from death. And the Gemara asks, if so, our obligation should be at least as great as when we recall the Exodus from Egypt, and so let us also recite Hallel on Purim. Now, we recite Hallel, that's a recitation often sung of Psalms 113 through 118. When do we do it? On Passover, on Shavuos, on Sukkot. All days when we celebrate the Exodus from Egypt. All those holidays are about becoming a people and leaving Egypt and being redeemed from Egypt. And we sing the Hallel on those holidays. We also sing it on Hanukkah. Hanukkah was another later addition, right? Much later than the events of the Torah. And we do sing Hallel on Hanukkah, but we do not sing Hallel on Purim. Why? So if so, let us also recite Hallel on Purim. And the Gemara answers, Hallel is not said on Purim because Hallel is not recited on a miracle. It was a miracle, but not a miracle that occurred, but it was a miracle that occurred outside the land of Israel. And we don't sing these songs on a miracle that happened outside the land of Israel. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, with regard to the Exodus from Egypt as well, which was a miracle that occurred outside the land of Israel, how are we able to recite the Hallel? If your reason is Hallel is only for something that happened in Israel, so that explains Hanukkah, but the events of the Exodus happened at Egypt and in the wilderness and at Mount Sinai, which is outside of Israel. We're not talking about Mount Sinai, but the Exodus happened outside of the land of Israel. And the Gemara answers, as it is taught in a Baraisa, prior to the time when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, all lands were deemed fit for songs of praise to be recited for miracles performed within their borders, as all lands were treated equally. But after the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, that land became endowed with a greater sanctity. According to the Torah, this land was given to the children of Abraham, was promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And now they were taking possession of that land, dispossessing it of people who were practicing awful abominations like sacrificing their children. Now it was given to the Jews who conquered it and dwelled in it under God's deed, right? The deed to the land is the Torah, right? It's the Bible. And so at that moment, the land of Israel acquired an enhanced sanctity because God said so. He said it was a holy land. Okay, so where are we? And so that is the difference. Prior to the time when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, all the lands were deemed fit for songs of praise to be recited. But after the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, that's when it became the Holy Land. And all the other lands were no longer deemed fit for songs of praise to be recited for miracles performed within them for the Jews, right? The Jews had the special status in the Holy Land promised to the Jews. So Rav Nachman said an alternative answer to why Hallel is not recited on Purim. The reading of the Megillah itself is an act of reciting Hallel. Instead of singing Psalms 13 through 18, which are about the salvation from Egypt and the salvation of God and our rejoicing and thanksgiving for all that he did for us, so is the book of Esther, but it's specific to the events of Purim. So says Rav Nachman, when we read the Megillah, it's like reciting Hallel. We don't have to recite Hallel also. It would be redundant. And Rava says a third reason why Hallel is not recited on Purim, granted that Hallel is set, and we don't have that for Hanukkah, right? The Hanukkah story did not make it into the Hebrew Bible. Granted that Hallel is said there when recalling the Exodus from Egypt, as after the salvation there, they could recite the phrase in Hallel, give praise, O servants of the Lord, Psalm 113, Psalm 113:1. After their servitude to Pharaoh ended with their salvation, then they were truly servants of the Lord and not servants of Pharaoh. But can it be said here, after the limited salvation commemorated on Purim, give praise, O servants of the Lord, which would indicate that after the salvation of the Jewish people, and after the salvation at Purim, the Jewish people were only servants of the Lord and not servants of Achashverosh? No, you can't say that, because even after the miracle of Purim, we were still servants of King Achashverosh of Persia. As the Jews remained in exile outside the Holy Land, in exile under Persian rule, and consequently the salvation was incomplete since they didn't merit to then have the Holy Land as they did, at the end of the process of the salvation from slavery in Egypt. And the Gemara asked, both according to the opinion of Rav and according to the opinion of Rav Nachman, this is difficult. Isn't it taught in a Baraisa cited earlier, after the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, that land became endowed with greater sanctity, and all the other lands were no longer deemed fit for songs of praise to be recited for miracles performed within them. Therefore, there should be no Hallel obligation on Purim for the miracle performed outside the land of Israel, and Rav Nachman's and Rava's alternative explanations are incorrect. Right? So the real reason is because we don't sing songs of praise like Hallel over salvation that is incomplete. We don't do that when it's a miracle outside the land of Israel for that reason. So they would be incorrect. And the Gemara answers, well, they understood differently, as it can be argued that when the people were exiled from Eretz Yisrael, the other lands returned to their initial suitability and were once again deemed fit for reciting Hallel on miracles performed within them. I mean, there have been some real miracles performed for Jews at different times in different places in the diaspora over the millennia since we were exiled from the Holy Land. And we're very thankful for those. But we don't sing Hallel when we recall those days on which those salvations occur. And this is why. And with regard to the statement that 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people, the Gemara asks, is there no one else? Isn't it written with regard to Samuel's father, Elkanah? And there was a certain echad man, but here called an echad, a one, from Ramatayim Zophim, from 1 Samuel 1:1. And this is expounded as follows, right? The introduction to the story of Samuel, we start with his father, and so this is going to be expounded to indicate that Elkanah was a prophet. He was one, echad, of 200 mata'im, prophets, Zophim, who prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people. If so, why was it stated that there are only 48 prophets? And the Gemara answers, in fact, there were more prophets, as it is taught in a Baraisa. Many prophets arose for the Jewish people, numbering double the number of Israelites who left Egypt. Let's repeat that. We have 55 prophets, right, whose names graced, carry books in the Bible, right? 48 prophets, 7 prophetesses. But there were many, many more prophets who arose in Israel and carried God's word, presumably as a prophet, not just silently, but, shared it with others. How many? As many as the number of Israelites who walked out of Egypt. Now, that number is usually thought as about 2 million, right? 2 million. Even if you say that number was very heavily padded by Egyptians who saw, Egypt is emptying out. These people have it, going on with God. I'm going to join them. And even if you don't count them, we're still talking about a huge number, hundreds of thousands. And there were that many prophets? Wow. So that makes you change your thinking about what prophecy is. Now, that's not, we don't know that this is a universally held opinion. To a certain degree, first of all, how many prophets left Egypt? Why are we comparing to all the people? Why is that? Because Bishalach, Parshas Bishalach, Torah portion Bishalach, it's coming up soon. When we cross the sea, we have a tradition that says even the lowliest person, like the least mystically inclined, totally unspiritual person who crossed the sea, had a greater degree of prophecy in that moment than the great prophet Isaiah. I mean, whose prophecy was so strong, right? So strong, Isaiah. How is that possible? Because they were walking in the midst of a miracle. It wasn't just, Charlton Heston raised his staff and the sea is like the whole world became almost like liquefied. You know what I'm saying? The intrusion of the Holy One, the presence of the Holy One was so palpable. This is why at Sinai it says, the mountains skipped like rams and the hills like lambs. I mean, the land was, it's almost like the Matrix. It's like the energy. The way that the land is all an expression of God's will became visible to everyone who was there. So at that time, there was, hundreds of thousands of prophets. And what they're saying is throughout Jewish history, there have been even more prophets among the people. How do you get defined as a prophet? Let's keep reading. In fact, there were more prophets. As it is taught in Baraisa, many prophets arose for the Jewish people, numbering double the number of Israelites who left Egypt. However, only a portion of the prophecies were recorded, because only prophecy that was needed for future generations was written down in the Bible for posterity. But that which was not needed, as it was not pertinent to the later generations, was not written. Therefore, the 55 prophets recorded in the Bible, although not the only prophets of the Jewish people, were the only ones recorded due to their eternal messages. So not everybody that plugged into some kind of holy experience, maybe that was given to them by the Lord for a reason. Perhaps they lived up to the mission of their prophecy. Perhaps they didn't. Who knows? We have a tradition that prophecy ended around the beginning of the Second Temple period. So it's not that everyone who's had a mystical experience is a prophet. It was something specific. But it happened more times in the past than we might have typically thought before we read this. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said another explanation of the verse, and there was a certain man from Ramatayim Zophim, a man who comes from two heights, Ramot, that face Tzofot one another. And Rabbi Chanin said an additional interpretation, a man who descends from people who stood at the height of Rumah, the world. And the Gemara asks, and who are these people? Who are these people? Like all these other prophets, what kinds of other people were prophets who stood at some kind of a height above the rest of the people and experienced something that others couldn't see, some kind of a prophecy? So we're getting different interpretations of that, right? A man who comes from two heights that face one another, or a man who descends from people who stood at a height of the world. Who are these? And the Gemara answers, these are the sons of Korach, right? So Korach was the one who led a rebellion against Moses in the wilderness, and the earth opened up and swallowed Korach and his followers, including much of his family. But we have Psalms in the book of Psalms that we recite, and it says a psalm of the sons of Korach, right? So they survived and actually were God-fearing, God-loving men who have a psalm that they composed that is still given in their name, the sons of Korach. And now we're being told that they were prophets. The sons of Korach were prophets. In what way? And who are these people? They are the sons of Korach, as it is written, but the sons of Korach did not die, right? They did not die. Numbers 26:11. Their father died, much of their family died, but these sons of Korach did not. And with regard to them, it is taught in the name of our teacher, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, who edited the Mishna, a high place was set aside for them in Gehenna, as the sons of Korach repented in their hearts and were consequently not propelled very far down in Gehenna when the earth opened to swallow Korach and his followers. And they stood on this high place and they sung to the Lord, and they alone stood at the height of the lower world. The world opened up. They were like right next to it. They had actually like a front row seat to Gehenna, that awful, dark, and burning place that refines souls who have transgressed in this world. Some permanently, very few. The rest of us, some a little, God willing, God forbid, but most souls are going to require some refining there before going on to other places in the world of souls. And the sons of Korach did not fall in, but they were right above it. And that was a form of prophecy, because that opening in the earth, it wasn't just some kind of volcanic activity, right? The earth parted and revealed like a portal right to Gehenna. And they were right there for that and survived. Those are the sons of Korach. The Gemara asks, with regard to the prophetesses recorded in the Baraisa, who were the 7 prophetesses of Israel? Here we go. Let's learn about the 7 prophetesses of Israel. And the Gemara answers, Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Avigail, Huldah, and Esther. Those are the 7 prophetesses of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. And the Gemara offers textual support. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, as it is written, Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. That's Genesis 11:29. And Rabbi Yitzchak said, Iscah is in fact Sarah. And why was she called Iscah? For she saw, Sakta, by means of divine inspiration. As it is stated, in all that Sarah has said to you, hearken to her voice. Abraham was told to listen to his wife. Now that's good advice for all husbands. But God told Abraham to listen to his wife because she had received prophecy. Alternatively, Sarah was also called Iska, for all gazed sochin upon her beauty. We're told that Sarah was as beautiful, at the sunset of her life as she was in the sunrise of her life. Miriam was a prophetess, Miriam the sister of Moses, as it is written explicitly. And Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand. Exodus 15:20. And the Gemara asks, was she the sister only of Aaron and not the sister of Moses? Why does the verse mention only one of her brothers? And Rav Nachman said that Rav said, for she prophesied when she was the sister of Aaron, i.e., she prophesied since her youth. Even before Moses became a prophet, Miriam was already a prophetess. She prophesied since her youth, even before Moses was born. As she would say, my mother is destined to bear a son who will deliver the Jewish people to salvation. And at the time when Moses was born, the entire house was filled with light, and her father stood and kissed her on the head and said to her, my daughter, your prophecy has been fulfilled. But once Moses was cast into the river, her father arose and rapped her on the head, gave her a punch, saying to her, my daughter, where is your prophecy now? As it looked as though young Moses would soon meet his end, right? She said, my brother is going to be born. He's going to save the Jewish people. When he was born, the house was like glowing, like a total, Hollywood scene. And then it seemed like they were going to have to kill this boy. Well, they didn't kill him. They didn't throw him in the river, but they put him in a basket so that at least he would have a few more minutes, an hour, who knows what, of life. He seemed destined to die. That's what his father was saying. Where's your prophecy now? And this is the meaning of that which is written in regard to Miriam's watching Moses in the river. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him, i.e., to know what would be the end of her prophecy. It seemed like she was so sure. Now it seems like it's not going to happen. But she follows that box down the river with the baby in it. And what does she see? Pharaoh's daughter pulls it up and falls in love with the baby? Of course she was a prophetess. And, enough said about Miriam. Devorah was a prophetess, as it is written explicitly, and Devorah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidos, in Judges 4:4. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the wife of Lapidos? And the Gemara answers, for she used to make wicks for the sanctuary, and due to the flames, Lapidos, on these wicks, she was called the wife of Lapidos, literally a woman of flames. With regard to Devorah, it says, and she sat under a palm tree, Judges 4:5. And the Gemara asks, what is different and unique with regard to her sitting under a palm tree that there needs to be written? She's sitting under a tree. What difference does it make that it's a palm tree? And Rabbi Shimon ben Avshalom said it is due to the prohibition against being alone together with a man. Since men would come before her for judgment, she established for herself a place out in the open and visible to all, in order to avoid a situation in which she would be secluded with a man behind closed doors, or even, somewhat off the view obfuscated of others by the low-hanging branches of some other kind of tree. With a palm, if you're sitting at the foot of a palm tree, everyone can see what's going on right there. And she made sure she was never secluded with the men who came to ask her for counsel, advice, for what to do, for prophecy. For judgment. I mean, she's explained as a judge, but she was a prophetess, is what we're learning. Alternatively, the verse means just as a palm tree has only one heart, as a palm tree does not send out separate branches, but rather has only one main trunk, so too the Jewish people in that generation had only one heart, directed to their Father in heaven. And that was in the times of Devorah. Hannah was a prophetess, as it is written, and Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. 1 Samuel 2:1. This is Hannah. We hear her story. It's Rosh Hashanah, right? Now I'm spacing. Is it Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur? But at any rate, it's the Haftorah during high holidays where we learn that she was weeping because her co-wife was, very fecund and having lots of kids, and Hannah was not blessed. She was childless, and she went and poured out her heart before the Lord, and the high priest thought she was drunk and scolded her. And she said, no, I'm not drunk. I'm opening my heart to the Lord. And from her, we learn how to pray. That Hannah. And she said, and Hannah prayed, and she said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. And her words were prophecy. Presumably this is when she was granted what she sought, the baby who became the prophet Samuel, right? So she really brought an important, one of the most important prophets into the world. So she's the mother of a prophet, and she herself is a prophet. And how do we know? Because she said, my horn is exalted. She could have said, my pitcher is exalted. As with regard to David and Solomon, who were anointed with oil from a horn, their kingship continued. Whereas with regard to Saul and Jehu, who were anointed with oil from a pitcher, their kingship did not continue. That's why you're the cornucopia. That's why you want your horn to be exalted and to be overflowing. That's the horn of anointment. This demonstrates that Hannah was a prophetess, as she prophesied that only those anointed with oil from a horn will merit that their kingship continue. And it was true. Apropos the song of Hannah, the Gemara further explains her words. There is none sacred as the Lord, for there is none beside you. Biltecha, 1 Samuel 2:2. Rav Yehuda bar Menashia said, do not read it as Biltecha, beside you, but rather read it as Levoletecha, to outlast you, as the attribute of the Holy One, blessed be He, is unlike the attribute of flesh and blood. It is an attribute of man that his handiwork outlasts him and continues to exist even after he dies. You hope that what you build will exist after you die. But the Holy One, blessed be He outlasts his handiwork. Nothing that the Lord builds will last longer than the Lord God's self. Hannah further said, neither is there any rock, tsur, like our God. Same verse. And this can be understood as saying that there is no artist, tsayar, like our God. How is he better than all other artists? God is the supreme artist, the most stylish, the most elegant, the most talented, the most deep, the most profoundly moving with his art. And how do we know that? Wait a minute. And how do we know that? There is no artist, Sayar, like our God. How is he far better than all other artists? Because man fashions a form upon a wall, but is unable to endow it with a breath and a soul, or fill it with innards and intestines. Whereas the Holy One, blessed be He, fashions a form of a fetus inside the form of its mother, rather than on a flat surface, and he endows it with breath and a soul, and he fills it with innards and intestines. Obviously, no artist can produce a human. God did that. He's the greatest of all time. Avigail was a prophetess, as it is written, and it was so, as she rode on the donkey and came down by the covert of the mountain. 1 Samuel 26:20. This is Avigail, who was married to a lout, who, when asked for food and for sustenance by David and his band of guerrilla warriors, said, no, I'm not going to give anything to those guys. And Avigail was like, oh my God, this guy's such an idiot. He's going to get us killed. So she loads up a bunch of wagons with sustenance from the farm for David and his men, and says, sorry, my husband didn't know what he was talking about. We, of course, want to give you what you deserve. But the guy was such a lout, he couldn't survive. And she ended up, I believe, married to David. So Avigail, who ends up married to David, a prophet. So, where are we? Avigail was a prophetess, as it is written, and it was so, as she rode on the donkey and came down by the covert of the mountain. And the Gemara asks, why does it say by the covert? Beseter, hidden, right? Seter, like Esther, hidden. The covert of the mountain. It should have said from the mountain. And the Gemara answers that, in fact, this must be understood as an allusion to something else. Rabbah bar Shmuel said Avigail, in her attempt to prevent David from killing her husband Nabal, came to David and questioned him on account of menstrual blood that comes from hidden parts, setarim, hidden parts of a body. How so? She took a cloth with some blood stain on it, and she showed it to him and asked him to rule on her status. whether or not she was ritually impure as a menstruating woman. This is something that women do, right? When it's not the time of their period, but a little bit of spotting occurs. And these are women that are just living by a very, very holy standard. And they know that if it's menstrual blood, then their husband and she are prohibited to each other until she goes through a purification, and she'll wait. But if it's just something not related to uterine blood, then it's not a problem, and they're permitted to each other, and they can make love. And some women in that situation would go to an expert, and David was the biggest expert of all, right? He's the king of Israel. He has the highest authority in Israel. At this time, he's not a king at this time, but he's the local authority, not just as a general with his men, a fighting future king, but also as a Torah sage, an expert in this law, the one most expert in this law in the region. So she goes to him and says, you're an expert in the law of our tribe. You're an expert in Torah. Tell me, if you will, state, if you will, is this, given this spot, am I permitted to my husband or not? That's how she approached him. She showed it to him. He said to her, because she came to him at night, he said to her, is blood shown at night? It's the perfect answer. You came to me at night. I can't, by firelight, I can't really get a good look at this. I have to look at this in sunlight. Only in sunlight can I make a judgment on this. That is the law. One does not examine bloodstained cloths at night, as it is difficult to distinguish between the different shades by candlelight. She said to him, if so, you should also remember another halacha, another Jewish law. Are cases of capital law tried at night? Since one does not try capital cases at night, right? Because you're not going to make a ruling on something that determines whether my husband and I are permitted to each other. How much more you should make a ruling on evidence that's going to lead to executing a guilty party, which is you're thinking going to kill my husband. Are cases of capital law tried at night? Since one does not try capital cases at night, you cannot condemn Naval to death at night. This impressed David. He said to her, Naval, your husband, is a rebel against the throne, as David had already been anointed as king by the prophet Samuel. So this is my confusion. He'd been anointed as king, but he was not ruling. And Naval refused his orders, and therefore there is no need to try him, as a rebel is not accorded the ordinary prescriptions governing judicial proceedings. And Avigail said to him, you lack the authority to act in this manner, as Saul is still alive. You may have been anointed to be the king to replace Saul, but King Saul is still alive. He is the king in actual practice, and your seal, Tivacha, has not yet spread across the world. Your kingship is not yet known to everybody. Therefore, you are not authorized to try someone for rebelling against the monarchy. And David accepted her words, and he said to her, and blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from coming to blood guilt. Right? He would have sentenced Naval for his behavior to be killed, right? I mean, when an army is at war and they're meeting resistance that they deem against the army, they'll kill, right? It's that. And he was ready to do it, but she made an argument with righteousness and holiness, and it won the day. And she was able to do that. Well, this is just sort of skill and knowledge of law. What's making her a prophet? The Gemara asks, this plural term, damim, literally bloods, indicates two. Why did David not use the Now we're going a little side trip about the ruling that he gave about the blood and the spots. Rather, this teaches that Avigail revealed her thigh and he lusted after her, and he went 3 parasangs by the fire of his desire for her and said to her, listen to me and allow me to be intimate with you. And Avigail then said to him, let this not be a stumbling block for you. Right? It says David wanted to kill her husband. She said, don't let this be a stumbling block for you. You shouldn't judge him. You shouldn't pass a capital sentence at night. But here's a possible alternative, deeper meaning that he was into her right away. He ends up married to her. He's into her then. He thinks he's going to take her. She says, don't commit that sin. I'm a married woman. By inference, from the word this, it can be understood that there is someone else who will in fact be a stumbling block for him. And what is that referring to? Don't let this be the stumbling block for you, because later Bathsheba is going to be a stumbling block for you. The incident involving Bathsheba. And in the end, this is what was, as indeed he stumbled with Bathsheba. And this demonstrates that Avigail was a prophetess. She foretold what would happen, as she knew this would occur. And this also explains why David blessed Avigail for keeping him from being responsible for 2 incidents involving blood on that day, killing Nabal and taking her. Apropos Avigail, the Gemara explains the additional details in the story. Avigail said to David, "Yet the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bond of life with the Lord your God." And when she parted from him, she said to him, "And when the Lord shall have dealt well with my Lord, and you shall remember your handmaid." When things go amazing for you, remember who I was. Perhaps she had some foresight that her husband was going to die, because her husband dies anyway, and quickly. Rav Nachman said that this explains the folk saying that people say, while a woman engaged in conversation, she also holds the spindle. I.e., while a woman is engaged in one activity, she is already taking steps with regard to another. Women can operate on multiple levels better than men. Avigail came to David in order to save her husband, Nabal. But at the same time, she indicates that if her husband dies, David should remember her and marry her. And indeed, after Nabal's death, David took Avigail for his wife. And some say that Rav Nachman referred to a different saying, "The goose stoops its head as it goes along, but its eyes look on from afar to find what it is looking for." So too, Avigail acted in similar fashion. Huldah was a prophetess. Huldah, as it is written, so Hilkiah the priest, and Achikam and Achbor, and Shaphan and Isaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, 2nd book of Kings 22:14, as emissaries of King Yoshia. As emissaries of King Yoshia. And the Gemara asks, but if Jeremiah was found there, how could she prophesy? Out of respect for Jeremiah, who was her superior, it would have been fitting that she not prophesy in his presence. And the sages of the school of Rav say in the name of Rav, Huldah was a close relative of Jeremiah, and he did not object to her prophesying in his presence. Imagine that, being the presence of a prophet like Jeremiah, what that must have been like. Take a moment. And then in the same room, he had a close relative who apparently was his equal in prophecy, was the real thing, and he allowed her to prophesy in his presence. That's something that, in terms of the honor, you don't teach in the presence of your teacher, and you wouldn't prophesy in the presence of Jeremiah unless your prophecy is great indeed, and he permitted it. And the Gemara asks, but how could Josiah, King Josiah, let's do the English pronunciation, but how could Josiah himself ignore Jeremiah and send emissaries to Huldah? The sages of the school of Rabbi Shelah said, because women are more compassionate, and he hoped that what she would tell them would not be overly harsh. And Rabbi Yochanan said a different answer. Jeremiah was not there at the time, but he went to bring back the 10 tribes from their exile. And from where do we derive that he brought them back? As it is written, for the seller shall not return to that which he has sold. Ezekiel 7:13. In other words, Ezekiel prophesied that in the future, the Jubilee year would no longer be in effect. Now, is it possible that the Jubilee year had already been annulled? The laws of the Jubilee year apply only when all the tribes of Israel are settled in their respective places, which could not have happened since the exile of the 10 tribes more than a century earlier. But the prophet is prophesying that it will cease only in the future. And rather, this teaches that Jeremiah brought back the 10 tribes from their exile. I mean, think about that for a second, right? We've heard many times, the lost tribes of Israel. Here we're saying they're not lost. A lot of them were, exiled in that Assyrian exile, but Jeremiah went out, traveled around, and said, Jews from neighboring lands, come back, right? And so it's not that they were lost. Maybe they didn't have the same identities and, sort of tribedom physically in the land of Israel, after that, but the Jews from those tribes came back. According to this teaching, they were brought back by Jeremiah. And Josiah, the son of Ammon, ruled over the 10 tribes, as it is written. And then he said, "What monument is that which I see?" And the men of the city told him, "It is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things that you have done against the altar of Bethel." Now, what connection did Josiah, the king of Judea, have with the altar of Bethel, a city in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom? Remember, there was that terrible, terrible schism, that break, the civil war, the break of into two kingdoms after King Solomon. It lasted such a short time, right? There was Saul briefly, there was King David, nice long reign, King Solomon, nice long reign. And then as soon as Solomon dies, the kingdom splits in two. The northern kingdom of Israel that does not contain Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judea that does contain Jerusalem. So the northern kingdom had to build its own altar so that people could follow the laws of the Torah, but it was phony because the only real altar was in Jerusalem. Now, what is the connection? What connection did Josiah, the king of Judea, have with the altar of Bethel, a city in the kingdom of Israel? Rather, this teaches that Josiah ruled over the 10 tribes of Israel. And Rav Nachman said, proof that the tribes returned may be adduced from the verse here. Also, O Judah, there is a harvest appointed for you when I would return the captivity of my people. Hosea 6:11, which indicates that they returned to their places. I am just about done. We have one more prophetess left. We've been working our way through the 7 prophetesses of Israel. Which one have we not yet mentioned? Esther. Esther. We're going to finish with Esther, although this discussion will continue tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Let me just mention quickly, Monday, tomorrow night, our dear departed friend of blessed memory, Moti Kest. It's his Shloshim. So the AT app is going to be named after Moti Kest. I'll tell you more about him in the future, but I've talked about him before. Very special guy, 42 years old, a father and a grandfather, my fellow member of Magen Am. And tomorrow night marks the 30th day since his soul departed from this world. And that's the Shloshim. It's going to be a special memorial gathering, and it's at the time of our class. So we won't have class tomorrow night. With God's help, we'll have a double DAF on Tuesday. So Moti Kes Shloshim tomorrow, no class tomorrow night, double DAF on Tuesday. And may Moti's memory always be for a blessing. He loved Torah so much. He loved accidental Talmudists. I mean, like right after I met him, he asked how he could help, how he could give. He was the first guy in this neighborhood to kind of, welcome me in and become my friend. And it's, in our minyan, the Rav invited me to become the gabbai, but it's like I really got to know Moti first. We all miss him so much, and we trained together in Magen Am. He was way ahead of me. I'm a security officer at our synagogue. We're all licensed guards to carry firearms. And Moti knew a lot more and coached me and helped me. I'm sorry, I'm just digressing, but I'll be at his Shloshim tomorrow night. Okay. Esther. Esther was also a prophetess, as it is written, and it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther clothed herself in royalty. Esther 5:1. And it should have said Esther clothed herself in royal garments. Rather, this alludes to the fact that she clothed herself with a divine spirit of inspiration. She clothed herself with royalty. You might think that means, well, as soon as she became queen, she was able to act like a queen, though she wasn't born royal, right? No, that's not what it means. What it means is that she, it's so beautiful the way it's put. It should have said she clothed herself in royal garments. Rather, it alludes to the fact that she clothed herself with a Ruach HaKodesh, with the divine spirit, divine inspiration. The Ruach HaKodesh is prophecy. One who has Ruach HaKodesh is prophesying, has prophecy. That is the Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh. It is written there, and she clothed herself, and it is written elsewhere, and the Spirit clothed Amasai 1 Chronicles 12:19. And just as there the reference is to being enclothed by Ruach HaKodesh, so too Esther was enclothed by Ruach HaKodesh. That's what we have today. Let me go to your comments and questions. Was this not an amazing DAF? This one delivered. Megillah 14, home address for the 7 prophetesses of Israel. Ifa, wow, Sal, you remembered my town. Does that mean you might remember the pronunciation of my name so I don't need to keep writing it? What do you mean? I thought I'm pronouncing it the way you said it. Ifa, right? I mean, am I saying it wrong? I thought I was saying it the way it was written to be said. Let me know. Sharon, in the fact that we only say the bracha about commanding us to hear the Megillah on Megillah's Esther and not the other 4 because of what is being said in this page. Hold on. Exactly, right? Sharon is saying, no, I am saying it right. Okay, thanks, Nina. No, you don't have to keep telling me how to pronounce it. If I'm saying it right, I've got it. Okay, now Sharon is saying, when we read the Megillah of Purim, right, the book of Esther, when we read it out loud, as we are commanded to do, we're commanded to hear it, so somebody has to read it so that the others can't hear it. And we say, blessed are you, Lord of God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to read that book. Now, God didn't mention it in the Torah, but we say that because in this case, not our sages decreed that we should do that, like they decreed we must light the Hanukkah candles. We also say, sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to, even though the sages decreed that we have to do that. But in the book of Esther, the fact that she decreed, right, a speaker from what? From the books of the Bible. Not a sage, but from the prophets. And that's why it says, right, that the prophets didn't add any laws except one. Who? Esther. Esther added a law. She is the prophet, right? We're not told that Mordecai is a prophet. We're told that Esther is a prophet. And so she alone of the prophets was allowed to add a commandment. And that's why we say we are commanded. Just so, Sharon. Sharon also says, we know there are many places in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, where unnamed prophets are referenced. Ahav, King Ahab, and Jezebel, the evil Jezebel, murdered dozens of prophets, causing Elijah to flee for his life. Exactly. We know there's many unnamed prophets, and it's a fascinating subject. There's novels written about it. The Lamp of Darkness, right? That's what it's called. Nina, let me know. Awesome, like young adult series set in that world, and people sort of aspiring to become prophets. Some make it, some don't. The musicians that help them prophesy, the way they're hunted by Ahab and Jezebel. That was in the period of Elijah, and Elijah's the one who survived and took on all the prophets of the false gods of Baal and Ashtaroth, right? Brought down by Jezebel, and just whooped them in that whole incident. Yes, there were many unnamed prophets. Yosef, wasn't there something like a school of the prophets? You were right ahead of me. There you go. I just mentioned it. Seraphim. So I guess we know where Dante got his idea for there being different circles of hell, i.e. Gehenna, right? That nice image of the sons of Korach perched right over. And the way it's described here in our Gemara is that they did go down. They were like associated with that wicked man, Korach. They didn't fall in, but they were, sort of at the highest level of Gehenna at that moment. And they were rescued. They didn't fall in, but they were the closest to it, right? They were a little lower than everyone else. They were the closest to it. And Jeremy, when did Uriah die? You said before. So Uriah dies on the battlefield, right? So David sets his eyes on Bathsheba and sends him to the front lines, where he is indeed killed, and then he ends up marrying the guy's wife. Right? So that's in that episode. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow on Tuesday, 6 p.m. Tomorrow I'll be at a Shloshim, double daf. I almost hate to do it. This whole section of the Megillah is so rich. But we'll have a double daf, unless it just makes no sense to do it, in which case we'll just do a single on Tuesday and maybe do the double on Wednesday. But we'll work it out. Good night.